London, July 1936. Inside the prestigious Sotheby's auction house, a heavy, battered metal trunk is finally cracked open. A crowd of wealthy collectors and esteemed academics leans in, expecting to find the lost, brilliant calculations of the man who built the modern world, Sir Isaac Newton. But as the dusty, yellowed papers are pulled into the light, a collective chill fills the room. These are not the neat, orderly equations of gravity or motion. The pages are covered in bizarre, coded symbols. There are frantic, obsessive recipes for the mythical philosopher's stone, an ancient elixir promising immortality and limitless gold. There are feverish, complex calculations, completely unrelated to science, attempting to pinpoint the exact year the world will end in a terrifying apocalypse. The winning bidder that day, the famous economist John Maynard Keynes, spent months poring over these hidden diaries. When he finally looked up from the pages, he realized a shocking truth.
He famously declared to the world that Isaac Newton was not the first scientist of the age of reason. He was, in fact, the last of the magicians. For over 200 years, the Royal Scientific Establishment had deliberately buried these papers. They were terrified that the public would discover that the supreme architect of modern physics was, in reality, an obsessed alchemist and a doomsday prophet who operated entirely in the shadows. Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. The visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Just sit back, relax, and let us take you back to a dangerous era where science, religion, and dark magic were exactly the same thing. To understand the sheer scale of this academic cover-up and why so many powerful people were desperate to hide the truth for over 2 centuries, we first have to understand the towering, almost godlike monument that was the public version of Sir Isaac Newton. We have to look at the perfect, rational statue they built for the world to admire before we can understand why they were so terrified of the man hiding behind it. Let us travel back to the year 1665. England is a terrifying place to be. The Great Plague, a devastating outbreak of the bubonic plague, is sweeping through the crowded, filthy streets of London. Thousands of people are dying every single week. Panic is everywhere. To escape the deadly disease, the universities shut their doors, sending their students away to the safety of the isolated countryside. Among these fleeing students is a quiet, intense 22-year-old named Isaac Newton. He returns to his childhood home, Woolsthorpe Manor, a quiet farm surrounded by nature. And it is here, according to the legend that every schoolchild is taught, that he sits under an apple tree. He watches an apple fall to the ground. Now people had been watching things fall for thousands of years, but Newton's genius was asking a simple, brilliant question. Why did it fall straight down? Why didn't it go sideways or upwards? And more importantly, if this invisible force can pull an apple from a branch down to the dirt, how far up does this force go? Does it reach the clouds? Does it reach the moon? Newton realized that the exact same invisible tether pulling the apple to the ground is the same force holding the moon in its orbit around the Earth. He called it gravity. Today we take this for granted, but at the time, this was an earth-shattering realization. Before Newton, humanity looked up at the night sky and saw a realm of magic, mystery, and divine miracles. Comets were seen as terrible omens sent by angry gods. The movement of the planets was considered a spiritual mystery that human minds were simply not meant to understand. Newton changed all of that permanently. When he eventually published his masterwork, a massive, dense book known as the Principia Mathematica, he proved that the universe was not a chaotic place of magic. Instead, he showed that the universe was like a gigantic, perfectly constructed clock. And just like a clock, it operated on strict, predictable, mathematical rules. Once you understood the gears and the springs, the laws of physics, you could calculate the movement of anything, from a rolling ball on a table to the grandest planets in the solar system. Overnight, this made Newton more than just a famous scientist. It made him an intellectual superhero. He became the ultimate symbol of the Age of Reason, a new era where logic, evidence, and rational thought were meant to conquer the old world of superstition and darkness. By the time he died in 1727 at the age of 84, he was treated not like a mere professor, but like a conquering emperor. He was given a massive state funeral. His coffin was carried by high-ranking nobles, lords, and the most powerful men in the British Empire. He was buried in Westminster Abbey, a place normally reserved strictly for kings and queens. The great French writer Voltaire, who was living in London at the time, attended the funeral and was deeply moved. He wrote back to France, amazed that the English honoured a man of science, the way other nations only honoured bloodthirsty kings. A famous poem was even written for him by Alexander Pope, capturing how society viewed him. Nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, "Let Newton be," and all was light. He was the patron saint of logic, the flawless father of modern science. But within days of his spectacular funeral, behind closed doors, a massive crisis was quietly unfolding. Because Newton was a lifelong bachelor with no children, the monumental task of sorting through his personal belongings fell to his niece's husband, a man named John Conduit. To help him organize what was expected to be a treasure trove of brilliant physics and mathematics, Conduit hired a highly respected physician and scholar named Dr. Thomas Pellet. Imagine the scene: Conduit and Dr. Pellet sitting in a quiet, dusty room, opening box after heavy box of Newton's personal, handwritten papers. They are expecting to find the unpublished secrets of the universe, perhaps new laws of motion, improved designs for telescopes, or revolutionary mathematical equations. Instead, as they cracked open the leather-bound notebooks and unrolled the loose sheets of parchment, they found a nightmare. There were millions of words, a mountain of text. But almost none of it was about physics. There was no calculus. There was no astronomy. Instead, Dr. Pellet found himself staring at bizarre, hand-drawn symbols of green lions, dragons, and naked figures floating in chemical baths. He found thousands of pages detailing dark, toxic experiments to create the mythical Philosopher's Stone. Worse yet, he found endless, obsessive essays where Newton aggressively attacked the core teachings of the Christian Church, calling them a grand deception. He found wild, apocalyptic timelines predicting the fiery end of the world based on hidden codes he believed were buried in the Bible. To say Dr. Pellet was horrified would be an understatement. He was looking at the private thoughts of a man who seemed entirely disconnected from the rational hero buried in Westminster Abbey. To understand the panic of these two men, we have to look closely at the severe, unforgiving society of 17th and early 18th century England. This was not a time of free speech or religious tolerance. Having the wrong ideas could get you killed, plain and simple. First, there was the issue of heresy. The official, legally mandated religion of England was Anglicanism, and its absolute core belief was the Holy Trinity. The idea that God the Father, Jesus the Son, and the Holy Spirit are all equally God wrapped into one entity. Newton's private papers revealed that he completely rejected this. He believed the Trinity was a massive fraud invented by corrupt priests hundreds of years after Jesus died. He believed praying to Jesus as God was a terrible sin called idolatry. Today this might just seem like a theological debate, but in Newton's time, denying the Trinity was a severe criminal offence under the Blasphemy Act. If these papers had been discovered while Newton was alive, he would have instantly been stripped of his prestigious professorship at Cambridge University. He would have been publicly shamed, heavily fined, and his entire life's work would have been confiscated. He likely would have faced brutal imprisonment. Second, there was the issue of alchemy. The men found massive notebooks detailing Newton's attempts to mutate base metals into gold. In our modern minds, we might just view this as silly, primitive chemistry, but in the 1600s, practicing alchemy was not just a strange hobby, it was treated as high treason against the crown. Why? Because the British government understood the economy. If a rogue alchemist actually succeeded in creating limitless gold in a secret basement, they could flood the market with it. The official gold coins minted by the king would become completely worthless. The entire British economy would collapse overnight. To prevent this, strict laws had been passed, specifically the Act Against Multipliers, which made the practice of multiplying precious metals punishable by hanging. So, sitting in that room, Doctor, Pellet and John Conduit realized they were holding a ticking time bomb. If they published these papers, the scandal would be apocalyptic. The entire reputation of Cambridge University, the Royal Society, and the British scientific establishment was built on the shoulders of Isaac Newton. If the rest of Europe, especially their rivals in France and Germany, found out that the champion of English reason was actually a closeted, heretical wizard who spent his nights boiling toxic metals and predicting the end of the world, it would destroy the credibility of British science forever. The great age of reason would be seen as a joke. They simply could not let the world see the man behind the curtain. Dr. Pellet went through the massive stacks of paper, taking a heavy pen and writing a simple, devastating verdict across the bundles of alchemy and theology. Foul drafts not fit to be printed. With those few words, a massive cover-up was initiated. The thousands of pages of dark magic, religious obsession, and doomsday prophecies were quickly and quietly stuffed back into their wooden boxes. The lids were nailed shut, they were loaded onto carriages and sent far away to the private estate of the Earl of Portsmouth, a wealthy aristocratic family connected to Newton's descendants. There, in a dark, quiet library, the boxes were locked away. The academic establishment formed a silent, unbreakable pact. For the next 200 years, whenever anyone asked to see the complete archives of the great Sir Isaac Newton, they were politely turned away. Biographers were only given access to his mathematical notes, carefully curated to maintain the illusion of the perfect, flawless scientist. The secret was safe. The world continued to worship the Newton of the apple tree, completely unaware of the Newton of the fiery furnace. The ultimate man of logic was successfully sanitized for the history books. But secrets of that magnitude rarely stay buried forever. And as we are about to see, the true story of what Newton was actually doing in those shadowy, smoke-filled rooms was far more bizarre, dangerous, and fascinating than anything his protectors could have possibly imagined. To the modern mind, the word alchemy sounds like something pulled straight out of a fantasy movie. We picture an old wizard in a pointed hat, waving a wand over a bubbling cauldron, muttering magic words to turn a rusty horseshoe into a brick of solid gold. Because of this, it is incredibly difficult for us today to understand how a genius like Isaac Newton, the man who invented calculus and discovered the laws of gravity, could fall for such a ridiculous fairy tale. But to understand Newton, we have to completely erase our modern understanding of chemistry. We have to look at the world through the eyes of someone living in the 1600s. Back then, alchemy wasn't considered a silly magic trick. It was the absolute cutting edge of human knowledge. It was the great, unsolved puzzle of the universe. At its core, alchemy was based on a very simple and surprisingly logical misunderstanding of how the earth worked. Today, we know that elements like iron, lead, and gold are fundamentally different at an atomic level. You cannot turn one into the other without a nuclear reactor. But in Newton's time, they didn't know about atoms. Instead, the brightest minds in the world believed that all metals grew deep inside the earth, almost like plants. They believed that lead, iron, and copper were simply unripe metals. If you left a piece of cheap lead buried in the ground for 1,000 years, it would slowly mature, purify, and eventually ripen into perfect, shining gold. Gold was seen as the ultimate, healthy, perfect state of matter. Everything else was just sick, corrupted, or unfinished gold. So the goal of the alchemist was actually quite practical. They wanted to build a laboratory that acted like an artificial womb. They wanted to take cheap, unripe metals, put them in a glass flask, apply intense heat and secret chemicals, and speed up the natural process of the earth. They wanted to do in a few weeks what nature took thousands of years to do. This process was known as transmutation, and to achieve it, alchemists were searching for a mythical, holy substance known as the Philosopher's Stone. Forget the idea of an actual heavy rock. The Philosopher's Stone was described in ancient texts as a magical powder or a dark red liquid. The legend stated that if you could figure out the impossibly complex recipe to create this stone, a single pinch of it dropped into a pot of melted lead would instantly transform the entire pot into pure, flawless gold. But the stone promised something even greater than infinite wealth. Because gold was considered pure, indestructible, and immune to rust or decay, alchemists believed that the Philosopher's Stone contained the literal essence of life itself. If it could cure the sickness in a piece of lead and turn it to gold, what would happen if a human being drank it? They believed it would cure all biological sickness. It would heal any disease. It would reverse aging. It was the elixir of life, the ultimate medicine that could unlock physical immortality. When we look at it this way, it makes perfect sense why Newton was obsessed. He was a man who wanted to understand the absolute limits of the universe. Gravity explained the massive planets in the sky, but alchemy promised to explain the invisible secrets of matter right here on Earth. For Newton, finding the Philosopher's Stone wasn't about getting rich. It was about finding the master key to God's creation. However, pursuing this master key was incredibly dangerous. As we mentioned briefly before, the British government was terrified of alchemy, and they had good reason to be. Europe was crawling with con artists and fake alchemists known as puffers, named after the bellows they used to puff air into their fires. These swindlers would travel from town to town, performing sleight-of-hand tricks to convince wealthy lords and kings that they could make gold out of thin air. They would ask for massive investments to fund their research and then vanish into the night with the money. But the real terror for the crown was the possibility that someone might actually succeed. The entire wealth and power of the British Empire was tied to the rarity of gold. If a reclusive genius actually figured out how to manufacture it in a basement, money would become meaningless. The social order would collapse. Therefore, practicing alchemy was treated as a crime of the highest order, often punished by public execution. This meant Newton had to operate in total, paranoid secrecy. If you were to visit Trinity College at Cambridge University during Newton's time, you would see beautiful, manicured lawns, grand stone buildings, and wealthy young aristocrats walking through the courtyards debating philosophy and mathematics. It was the center of elite, polite society. But tucked away just outside the window of Newton's private chambers, hidden from the pristine lawns, was a very different scene. Newton had secretly constructed a dark, wooden shed. This was his alchemy laboratory, and it was a place of nightmares. Unlike the quiet, clean libraries where he supposedly did his thinking, this shed was a loud, filthy, and violently hot industrial sweatshop. Inside, Newton had built massive brick furnaces. These weren't fireplaces for warmth. These were highly specialized ovens designed to reach roaring, terrifying temperatures necessary to melt raw metals. For weeks and sometimes months on end, these fires never went out. The atmosphere inside the shed was suffocating. There were no safety regulations, no ventilation hoods. The air was thick with grey smoke, choking dust, and the terrible, rotten egg stench of burning sulphur. Shelves bent under the weight of glass flasks, glowing metal crucibles, and jars filled with strange, highly toxic compounds, arsenic, antimony, and most dangerously, massive quantities of mercury. In the center of this chaotic, sweltering room stood the greatest mind of a generation. But he did not look like the polished, dignified gentleman painted in the history books. According to the accounts of his assistant, a man named Humphrey Newton, no relation to Isaac, the Isaac Newton of the laboratory was a terrifying, almost wild figure. He rarely slept. When a critical experiment was running which involved carefully raising and lowering the temperature of the fire over several days, Newton would refuse to leave the furnace. He would stay awake for 72 hours straight, staring unblinking into the blinding orange flames, poking the coals, his face covered in black soot and sweat. Humphrey recorded that his master would frequently forget to eat. Meals would be brought to his room, sit there for a day, and be taken away completely untouched. He barely bathed. His wig was often uncombed, his clothes stained with burn marks and acid spills. He was a man entirely consumed by a manic obsession, entirely disconnected from the human world outside his wooden door. What was he actually doing in there? He was trying to break matter down to its absolute soul. Newton's experiments often focused on a bizarre and dangerous concept known as the putrefaction of metals. Alchemists believed that before you could build a perfect metal like gold, you first had to completely destroy the starting material. You had to kill it. Newton would take mixtures of iron, copper, and highly toxic acids, seal them tight in a glass bubble, and heat them over a slow, steady fire for weeks. He was waiting for the metal inside to break down, into a black, bubbling, rotting sludge. He called this the Black Crow, or the death of the metal. He believed that once the physical body of the metal was dead, its spirit would be released, floating up to the top of the glass as a colored vapor. But his ultimate fascination and his ultimate downfall was Mercury. Mercury, also known as quicksilver, is one of the most fascinating and bizarre elements on Earth. It is a heavy metal, just like lead or iron, but it is liquid at room temperature. It rolls around like silver water. To the alchemists, this was pure magic. Because it was a metal that behaved like a fluid, they believed Mercury was the seed of all other metals. They believed that if they could figure out how to manipulate Mercury, how to turn it into a solid, or how to combine it with the right magical heat, it would hatch into the philosopher's stone. Because of this belief, Newton played with Mercury constantly. And he did so with zero protective equipment. Today we know that Mercury is a devastating neurotoxin. It attacks the brain and the central nervous system. Even a few drops spilled on the skin can be incredibly dangerous. But Newton wasn't just touching it. One of the most terrifying things about Newton's scientific method was that he used his own body as a testing instrument. In his hidden diaries, he documented the exact taste of dozens of toxic chemicals. He would dip his finger into strange, bubbling concoctions of arsenic and heavy metals, place it on his tongue, and record whether it tasted sweet, salty, or sharp. Worse than the tasting was the breathing. When Newton heated massive bowls of mercury over his roaring furnaces, the liquid metal would boil and turn into an invisible vapor. Because he was hunched over the fire, staring intently into the glass flasks to watch for the slightest color change, he was breathing in massive lungfuls of pure, vaporized mercury day after day, year after year. He was slowly, systematically poisoning himself to death. If you have ever heard the phrase mad as a hatter, it comes from the 19th century hat-making industry, where workers used mercury to cure felt hats. The continuous exposure to mercury vapor destroyed the workers' brains, causing severe tremors, paranoia, extreme mood swings, and terrifying hallucinations. Isaac Newton, the father of logic, was exposing himself to levels of mercury far beyond any hat maker. For over 20 years, this secret life continued. By day, he was the brilliant, quiet professor of mathematics, occasionally venturing out to give lectures to empty rooms. Because his math was so advanced, students rarely showed up. By night, he was a soot-covered sorcerer, breathing toxic fumes, searching for the key to immortality in a bubbling pot of poison. He kept his two worlds entirely separate. He never told his colleagues at the Royal Society about the furnaces. He wrote his alchemy recipes in a complex mythical code so that if a servant or an inspector ever found his papers, they would think they were reading a strange book of poetry about flying dragons and green lions rather than a recipe for high treason. But a human body and a human mind can only take so much abuse. You cannot spend decades inhaling poison, starving yourself, and living in a state of hyper-paranoid secrecy without a massive consequence. The heat of the furnace, the isolation, and the invisible toxic metals creeping into his bloodstream were building up to a breaking point. The perfect rational machine that was Isaac Newton's brain was beginning to fracture, and soon the greatest scientist in the world would plunge into a terrifying period of madness that would nearly destroy him entirely. If you were a spy working for the British Crown in the late 1600s and you somehow managed to pick the lock on Isaac Newton's heavy wooden door, you would probably think you had broken into the room of a mad poet, not a criminal mastermind. If you quickly grabbed one of his leather-bound notebooks from the ash-covered desk and flipped it open, you wouldn't find lists of illegal chemicals or diagrams for counterfeiting money. You wouldn't find anything that looked remotely like chemistry. Instead, you would read bizarre, highly dramatic stories about mythological creatures. You would read about a fierce green lion hunting down and devouring a shining sun. You would find instructions on how to catch Diana's doves in flight, or how to bathe a red king in a pool of silver water until he dissolved. To the untrained eye, this looked like harmless, perhaps slightly unhinged, fantasy literature. And that was exactly the point. Newton was terrified of being discovered. As we established, practicing alchemy to create the Philosopher's Stone was an act of high treason, punishable by a gruesome death. But his fear went much deeper than just the hangman's noose. Newton honestly believed that the Philosopher's Stone was a divine secret. It was the ultimate power over life and death, handed down by God to a select, worthy few in ancient times. He believed that if this world-altering recipe fell into the hands of ordinary, greedy people, or worse, corrupt kings who just wanted to fund endless wars, it would destroy the world. So he created an incredibly complex cryptographic system. He didn't use numbers or mathematical ciphers. He used an elaborate language of symbols, colors, and ancient Roman gods to hide his recipes in plain sight. Let's decode a few of these secrets so you can see exactly how this genius disguised his highly dangerous chemistry. Imagine you are reading one of Newton's private recipes and it instructs you to let the fierce green lion devour the sun and collect the blood that spills. It sounds like a dark fairy tale, but to Newton this was a very precise laboratory instruction. In the underground world of alchemy, the sun always represented gold because of its bright, yellow, perfect nature. The green lion was the secret code name for a highly corrosive, powerful acid, specifically nitric acid, mixed with other toxic compounds. When you pour this strong acid over a piece of solid gold, a violent chemical reaction occurs. The acid actually eats the gold, dissolving the indestructible metal into a liquid state. During this violent reaction, the liquid turns a deep, dark red color. So the green lion devouring the sun is simply a covert way of saying, use nitric acid to completely dissolve solid gold and collect the red liquid that remains. What about Diana's doves? Diana was the ancient goddess of the moon. In alchemy, the moon always represented silver. When Newton wrote about catching Diana's doves, he was talking about a dangerous process involving mercury and silver. When you heat this mixture over a roaring furnace, the mercury turns into a white, silvery vapor that floats upward, like a flock of white doves taking flight. Catching them meant placing a cold glass tube at the top of the flask so the vapor would hit the cold glass, condense back into liquid drops and drip into a separate bowl. Every single animal, planet, and god in Newton's notebooks was a disguised chemical element. Mars was iron, Venus was copper, Saturn, the slow and heavy planet, was lead. He was writing a highly technical, completely illegal chemistry manual disguised as a fantasy novel. And he spent decades writing millions of words in this code, desperately chasing the ultimate prize, the Philosopher's Stone. We have to remember why this was so important to him. Newton was not a man who cared about buying mansions or fine clothes. He wore plain, often messy clothes and ate simple meals. He didn't want the stone to make unlimited gold so he could be rich. He wanted the stone because he believed it was the breath of God trapped in physical matter. Newton believed that the universe was broken and decaying since the time of Adam and Eve. The Philosopher's Stone was the divine agent of healing. If you dropped it on cheap metal, it healed it into gold. If a human drank it, it healed their mortal body, granting perfect health and potentially eternal life. To Newton, finding the stone meant proving that God had left a back door, a hidden cheat code in the fabric of the universe. And there were moments where he genuinely believed he was inches away from unlocking it. One of the most thrilling and dangerous experiments Newton obsessively repeated involved a highly toxic, dark grey mineral called antimony. In the 1600s, no one really understood what antimony was, but it behaved strangely when melted. Newton would take raw antimony ore, mix it with iron and silver, and place it in a thick clay bowl. He would plunge the bowl into the very heart of his roaring brick furnace, raising the temperature to over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The metals would melt together into a glowing, blindingly bright, molten soup. Then came the crucial moment. He would pull the glowing bowl from the fire and let it cool very slowly in the cold, damp air of his shed. As the metal hardened from a liquid back into a solid, an incredible chemical reaction took place. Because of the way the crystals formed as it cooled, a perfect, brilliant geometric star pattern would magically appear on the surface of the solid, silver-grey metal. Today, chemists know this simply as the crystalline structure of antimony cooling under specific conditions. It is a natural physical reaction. But imagine being Isaac Newton in the 1670s, standing alone in a dark, smoky room in the middle of the night. You look down into your cooling pot of metal, and a perfect, glowing star has miraculously drawn itself onto the surface. He called it the star Regulus of antimony. For Newton, this was not just a neat trick. It was a terrifying, beautiful miracle. He believed the planets and the stars in the night sky emitted invisible spiritual rays. He believed that by perfectly mixing the metals and using the exact right amount of heat, he had created a metal magnet that literally pulled a star down from heaven and trapped its cosmic energy in the bowl. He believed he was successfully bridging the gap between the sky and the earth. He was playing God. But playing God in a poorly ventilated shed comes with a terrible price. While his mind was soaring through the heavens, decoding the secrets of angels and stars, his physical body was rapidly decaying. The invisible enemy in the room was the very thing he considered the seed of life: Mercury. As we covered earlier, Newton was breathing in vaporized mercury on a daily basis. He was touching it with bare hands. He was putting it on his tongue. He was completely unaware that this heavy metal was slowly building up in his bloodstream, crossing the blood-brain barrier and systematically destroying his central nervous system. By the time Newton reached his early 50s, the decades of isolation, starvation, sleep deprivation, and severe heavy metal poisoning finally triggered a catastrophic collapse. The year 1693 is known as the Black Year of Isaac Newton's life. It started with a severe case of insomnia. The man who was used to staying awake for 3 days straight to watch a furnace suddenly found that he could not sleep at all, even when he desperately wanted to. He would lie awake for 5, sometimes 6 days in a row, his mind racing with paranoid thoughts. And then came the physical tremors. His hands, which had so steadily drawn the delicate diagrams of gravity and the solar system, began to shake uncontrollably. He developed a permanent, sickening metallic taste in his mouth. He lost his appetite entirely, wasting away to skin and bones. But the most terrifying symptom was what the Mercury was doing to his reality. Newton plunged into a severe paranoid psychosis. He became utterly convinced that there was a massive, invisible conspiracy against him. He believed that the few people he actually spoke to were secret agents trying to steal his alchemical discoveries, or worse, trying to assassinate him. The most heartbreaking evidence of this breakdown survives today in the form of letters he wrote to his very few friends. One of his closest acquaintances was the famous philosopher John Locke. They had spent many evenings discussing theology and science. But in September of 1693, John Locke received a chilling, unhinged letter from Newton. Out of nowhere, Newton accused Locke of being a terrible, evil person who was actively trying to destroy his life. Newton wrote that he believed Locke had designed a plot to embroil him with women to ruin his pure, celibate reputation. He aggressively stated that he wished Locke were dead. Another friend, Samuel Pepys, a highly respected government official, received a similarly terrifying letter. Newton wrote to Pepys saying that he was in immense danger, that he must isolate himself immediately, and that he could never see Pepys or any of his friends ever again. Pepys and Locke were completely baffled and deeply alarmed. They exchanged letters with each other, wondering if the greatest genius in the world had permanently lost his mind. Pepys wrote that Newton's letter sounded like a man under a great disorder of his head. In modern terms, Newton was experiencing extreme paranoia, delusions of persecution, and severe mood swings, all textbook symptoms of advanced mercury poisoning, completely identical to the Mad Hatter syndrome that would be diagnosed centuries later. For months, Newton vanished completely into the dark confines of his Cambridge chambers. He stopped teaching. He stopped writing his coded diaries. He stopped tending to his furnaces. The roaring fires in his laboratory finally burned down to cold grey ash. The great engine of his mind had ground to a horrifying halt. For a long time, historians simply called this his nervous breakdown, attributing it to overwork, stress, or the loss of a close friendship. It wasn't until the 1970s that the horrifying physical truth was finally proven beyond a shadow of a doubt. Centuries after his death, a surviving lock of Isaac Newton's hair, kept as a souvenir by a collector, was subjected to modern forensic analysis. Using advanced scientific tools that Newton himself would have marveled at, researchers examined the chemical makeup of his hair strands. The results were absolutely staggering. The safe, normal level of mercury in a human body is practically 0. The researchers found that Newton's hair contained mercury levels nearly 40 times the normal limit. His body was completely saturated with poison. His hair also showed massive, deadly spikes of lead and arsenic. The autopsy of his hair proved that the father of modern science hadn't just suffered a psychological breakdown. He had literally poisoned his own brain in his relentless pursuit of magic. Slowly, agonizingly, over the course of a year, the paranoid fogs began to lift. By staying away from the furnaces during his illness, his body began to very slowly flush out some of the toxins. The tremors lessened. the hallucinations stopped. He wrote deeply apologetic letters to John Locke and Samuel Pepys, begging for their forgiveness and blaming his behavior on a distemper that had robbed him of his sleep and his reason. His mind was back, but he was forever changed. When he finally emerged from his chambers, he looked at his cold, dusty alchemy laboratory with a new sense of hesitation. The fire was gone. He realized that the physical search for the Philosopher's Stone had nearly killed him, but his obsession with finding God's hidden secrets was far from over. If the master key to the universe wasn't hidden in a boiling pot of mercury, he reasoned, then it must be hidden somewhere else. It must be hidden in the only other place God had left his fingerprint: the ancient texts. Leaving the toxic fumes behind, Newton locked the door to his laboratory and turned his obsessive, genius mind toward a completely new and equally dangerous target. He sat down at his desk, opened the Bible, and prepared to decode the mind of God mathematically. He was going to find out exactly how and precisely when the world was going to end. When Isaac Newton finally emerged from the dark, paranoid fog of his mercury-induced breakdown, he was a changed man. He had survived the physical and mental collapse that nearly destroyed him, but his fundamental obsession had not vanished. It had merely shifted. He realized that the physical world, the bubbling cauldrons of acid, the toxic vapors of mercury, and the elusive Philosopher's Stone was perhaps too dangerous, or perhaps he simply believed he had pushed physical matter as far as it could go. But Newton's core belief remained absolutely unshaken. God had hidden the ultimate secrets of the universe somewhere on Earth, and it was Newton's divine destiny to find them. If the master key wasn't buried in the periodic table of elements, then where was it? For Newton, the answer was obvious. It was sitting right on his wooden desk, bound in heavy leather. It was the Bible. To understand what Newton did next, we have to completely throw away our modern understanding of how people read religious texts. Today, a person might read the Bible to find moral guidance, spiritual comfort, or a sense of community. They read the stories of David and Goliath or the parables of Jesus to find meaning in their daily lives. Isaac Newton did not care about any of that. He did not read the Bible for comfort. He read it the way a master codebreaker reads an intercepted enemy transmission. Newton believed that the Bible was not just a collection of historical stories or moral lessons. He believed it was a massive, highly complex mathematical cryptogram dictated directly by God. He was convinced that the Almighty had hidden the true history of the universe, the secret laws of physics, and the exact blueprint of the future inside the text, deliberately scrambling the information so that ordinary, unworthy people could never understand it. Think of it like a brilliant computer programmer hiding a secret Easter egg or a hidden message deep inside the thousands of lines of code of a video game. The average player just plays the game, completely unaware. But another programmer, someone who understands the underlying language, can dig into the code, rearrange the lines, and uncover the secret. Newton believed he was that ultimate programmer. He believed God had specifically chosen him to crack the code. He approached this task with the exact same terrifying obsessive energy he used to map the laws of gravity. He taught himself ancient Hebrew. He learned Aramaic and Greek. He bought dozens of different translations of ancient texts and spread them across his desk, cross-referencing every single word. If a specific word appeared 30 times in the book of Daniel, he wanted to know exactly why it wasn't 31. He believed every single letter, every number, and every measurement mentioned in the Holy Book was a deliberate piece of a giant cosmic puzzle. And of all the puzzles hidden in the Bible, there was one that consumed his mind more than any other. It became a magnificent obsession that haunted him for decades. He became entirely fixated on a building, King Solomon's temple. According to the Hebrew Bible, King Solomon was the wisest and wealthiest king in human history. Around 3,000 years ago, he built a breathtaking, monumental temple in the city of Jerusalem. It was lined with pure gold, constructed from massive, perfect stones, and built with imported cedar wood. Deep inside this temple was a restricted room called the Holy of Holies, which housed the Ark of the Covenant, the golden chest carrying the original stone tablets of the Ten Commandments. Historically, this magnificent building was completely destroyed by the invading Babylonian army hundreds of years before Jesus was even born. Not a single stone was left standing. So why was the man who invented calculus so obsessed with a building that hadn't existed for over 2,000 years? Because Newton believed that King Solomon did not design the temple himself. Newton read the ancient scriptures, which stated that the exact architectural blueprint for the temple, the specific lengths of the walls, the heights of the pillars, the dimensions of the courtyards, was handed down directly to King David, Solomon's father, by the hand of God. To Newton's incredibly mathematical mind, this was a massive revelation. If God himself drew the floor plan, then the measurements of Solomon's temple were not arbitrary. They were divine geometry. Newton believed that the exact proportions of this building were a physical, mathematical scale model of the entire universe. He hypothesized that if he could perfectly recreate the architectural floor plan of the destroyed temple, he would uncover the sacred mathematics of creation itself. He believed the layout of the rooms contained the exact ratios of the planetary orbits, the secrets of gravity, and the timeline of human existence. But there was a massive problem. How do you measure a building that no longer exists? The Bible gives very specific measurements for the temple, but it doesn't use modern inches, feet, or meters. It uses an ancient unit of measurement called a cubit. In the ancient world, a cubit was generally understood to be the length of a man's arm, from the point of the elbow to the tip of the middle finger. But this is highly inaccurate. A tall man has a longer arm than a short man. To build a massive, perfectly proportional stone temple, the builders would have needed a standardized exact measurement. Newton needed to know, down to the exact millimeter, how long the specific sacred cubit of the ancient Hebrews was. If his math was off by even a fraction of an inch, the entire cosmic code would be wrong. This desperate need to find the exact length of a human arm from 3,000 years ago led Isaac Newton down one of the most fascinating rabbit holes of his entire life, connecting his biblical obsessions directly to the sands of Egypt. Newton realized that he couldn't just guess the length of the sacred cubit. He needed physical evidence from the ancient world. He turned his attention away from Jerusalem and looked further south toward the Great Pyramid of Giza. At the time, European explorers and astronomers were just beginning to systematically study the pyramids. A British astronomer named John Greaves had recently traveled to Egypt and taken incredibly precise measurements of the inside of the Great Pyramid, specifically the dimensions of the king's chamber hidden deep within the stone monument. Newton eagerly consumed Greaves's data. Why? Because Newton believed that the ancient Egyptians and the ancient Hebrews shared knowledge of sacred geometry. He calculated that if he could figure out the exact unit of measurement the Egyptians used to build the Great Pyramid, which he called the profane cubit, he could use a series of complex mathematical ratios to calculate the exact length of the Hebrew sacred cubit. It is absolutely mind-bending to imagine. The man who sat under an apple tree in England was using the dimensions of an Egyptian tomb to calculate the size of a destroyed Jewish temple, all to prove the physical laws of the solar system. After months of grueling mathematical calculations, Newton finally found his magic number. He determined the exact length of the sacred cubit, which he calculated to be roughly 25 modern inches. With this mathematical key in his hand, he went back to the Bible. He read the book of Ezekiel, which contains a highly detailed visionary description of the temple's layout. Using his newly discovered cubit, Newton began to draw. He spent years meticulously drafting highly technical architectural floor plans. He drew the outer courtyards, the inner sanctuaries, the placement of the altars, and the exact thickness of the walls. He didn't just do this once. He drew it over and over again, refining the math, obsessed with getting every single line perfectly proportioned according to the divine blueprint. And when he finally looked down at his completed masterpiece, what he saw completely validated his wildest theories. Newton did not just see a church. He saw a map of the solar system. In Newton's time, the scientific world had finally accepted the heliocentric model, the idea that the Sun is at the center of the solar system and the Earth and other planets orbit around it. This was a relatively new, modern scientific discovery championed by men like Copernicus and Galileo. But Newton's drawing of Solomon's temple told a different story. He noticed that at the very center of the temple complex was a massive altar where a sacred fire was kept burning day and night. Surrounding this central fire were different layers of courtyards where the priests and the worshippers would walk in circles. To Newton, the symbolism was obvious, perfect, and undeniable. The central fire represented the sun. The circular paths of the priests represented the planets moving in their orbits. Newton came to a staggering conclusion. He had not discovered the laws of gravity and the solar system. He had merely rediscovered them. He wrote deep into the night, arguing that ancient holy men like King Solomon and the ancient philosophers possessed a pure, perfect scientific knowledge of the universe, directly gifted to them by God. They knew about gravity. They knew the earth revolved around the sun. But over thousands of years, through wars, corruption, and the Dark Ages, humanity had lost this divine knowledge. It had been forgotten, buried under myth and bad translations. Newton believed his life's purpose was not to invent new science, but to act as a divine archaeologist. He was dusting off the lost, perfect knowledge of the ancients. This is why he spent so much of his life studying subjects that seem utterly crazy to us today. He wrote over 1 million words on theology and biblical prophecy, more than he ever wrote on physics, astronomy, and mathematics combined. He was trying to piece together a shattered mirror. His obsession with the floor plan of Solomon's temple proved to him that the universe was governed by strict, predictable, mathematical rules laid down by a master architect. And if the space of the universe was governed by a strict mathematical blueprint, then it was perfectly logical to assume that the time of the universe was also governed by one. Newton reasoned that God wouldn't just plan the architecture of the world, he would also plan its entire history, from the first day to the very last. Having successfully decoded the spatial dimensions of the ancient world through the temple, Newton now turned his piercing intellect toward a far more terrifying challenge. He was going to use the encrypted books of the Bible to decode the timeline of humanity. He was going to find out, mathematically, exactly when the clockwork of the universe was scheduled to stop. He was going to calculate the exact date of the apocalypse. Having convinced himself that God had used pure mathematics to design the physical space of the universe, hidden perfectly within the floor plan of King Solomon's temple, Isaac Newton inevitably took the next logical yet terrifying step. If the master architect had drawn a precise blueprint for the space of the universe, it was absolutely certain that he had also drawn a precise blueprint for the time of the universe. To Newton, history was not a random series of accidents, wars, and chaotic events. History was a massive, divine clock that had been wound up at the dawn of creation. And just like any clock, if you understood the gears, you could calculate exactly when the alarm was set to ring. Newton wanted to know when the clock would stop. He wanted to mathematically calculate the exact date of the apocalypse. To do this, he needed a different kind of map. He turned away from the architectural descriptions of the ancient temple and focused entirely on two of the most mysterious, confusing, and hallucinatory books in the entire Bible: the Book of Daniel in the Old Testament and the Book of Revelation in the New Testament. For the average reader, these books are terrifying and almost impossible to understand. They are filled with bizarre visions of multi-headed beasts rising from the ocean, dragons falling from the sky, angels pouring bowls of fire onto the earth, and strange metallic statues. For centuries, priests and scholars had argued over what these nightmares meant. Most people simply viewed them as scary, poetic warnings to be good, or else face the wrath of God. But Isaac Newton did not see poetry. He saw a massive encrypted data set. So let's look at exactly how Newton translated these ancient nightmares into a strict mathematical equation. We will focus on the Book of Daniel, which was Newton's ultimate obsession. In the Book of Daniel, there is a famous story about an ancient Babylonian king named Nebuchadnezzar. The king has a terrifying dream of a giant shining statue. The head of the statue is made of pure gold, the chest is made of silver, the belly is bronze, the legs are solid iron, and the feet are a weak mixture of iron and clay. Finally, a massive stone falls from the sky, smashes the feet, and the entire statue crumbles into dust. To Newton, this was not a fairy tale. This was a literal historical roadmap encoded by God. He decoded the statue perfectly. The different metals represented the timeline of human empires. The gold head was the Babylonian Empire. The silver chest was the Persian Empire. The bronze belly was the Greek Empire of Alexander the Great. The iron legs represented the brutal, crushing power of the Roman Empire. And the feet of iron and clay, that represented the fractured, divided nations of Europe that emerged after the fall of Rome. Newton realized that God was predicting history hundreds of years before it happened. The Book of Daniel had accurately predicted the rise and fall of Rome. Therefore, the rest of the book, the parts that hadn't happened yet, must also be mathematically accurate. Deep inside the Book of Daniel, an angel delivers a very specific, yet highly confusing, timeline for the end of the current world order. The angel states that a period of terrible corruption and darkness will last for a time, times, and half a time. Most people read that and throw their hands up in confusion. It sounds like absolute nonsense. But to a mathematician like Newton, it was a beautiful, elegant equation waiting to be solved. First, Newton had to understand the ancient calendar. In the modern world, a year is 365 days, but the ancient Jewish and prophetic calendars used a perfectly rounded mathematical year of exactly 360 days. Using this ancient calendar, Newton broke down the angel's strange phrase. A time equals exactly one ancient year, which is 360 days. Times, plural, equals 2 years, which is 720 days. Half a time equals half of a year, which is 180 days. If you add 360 plus 720 plus 180, you get exactly 1,260 days. But Newton knew the world wasn't going to end in a mere 1,260 days, and that was far too short. This is where he applied a widely accepted rule of biblical cryptography known as the day-year principle. In the coded language of prophecy, whenever a day is mentioned, it actually represents an entire year in physical human history. Therefore, the 1,260 prophetic days were actually 1,260 physical human years. Newton now had the magical number 1,260 years. This was the exact length of the final countdown. This was the ticking timer on the bomb, but an equation is useless if you don't know where to start counting. If a friend tells you they will arrive in exactly 60 minutes, you need to know exactly what time it is right now to know when they will appear. Newton had the duration, 1,260 years, but he desperately needed to find day zero. He needed the starting line. What historical event triggered the countdown? To find the answer, we have to remember Newton's deepest, darkest secret. As we explored earlier, Newton was a radical heretic. He secretly despised the Catholic Church and the mainstream Anglican Church because he believed the concept of the Holy Trinity was a massive, corrupt lie invented by evil men. Therefore, Newton believed that the day zero of the apocalypse countdown must be the exact historical moment when this corrupt church gained ultimate, unbreakable power over the world. He was looking for the precise year when the church stopped being a simple religion and mutated into a monstrous political empire. He scoured the history books, analyzing the fall of the Roman Empire and the rise of the popes in Europe. Finally, his finger stopped on a very specific, world-shattering event. The year was 800 AD. In the year 800 AD, on Christmas Day, the most powerful king in Europe, Charlemagne, Charles the Great, knelt inside St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. The Pope placed a golden crown on his head and declared him the Holy Roman Emperor. To any regular historian, this is just a famous political alliance, but to Isaac Newton, this was the ultimate crime against God. This was the exact moment that the religious power of the Pope combined with the brutal military power of a king. It was the birth of a monstrous two-headed beast. From the year 800 AD onward, the Church had the military power to execute anyone who disagreed with them, including people who practiced alchemy or denied the Trinity, people exactly like Isaac Newton. Newton had found his day zero. The puzzle pieces locked together with a terrifying mathematical click. He took his starting date, the year 800 AD, He added the divine countdown he had calculated from the book of Daniel, 1,260 years, 800 plus 1,260. The result was the year 2060. For decades, Newton kept this calculation entirely to himself. He wrote it down not in a grand published book of science, but hastily scribbled it on a random scrap of paper, a piece of old stationery that also contained some boring calculations about the weight of gold coins. This tiny, fragile scrap of paper, officially known today as Yehuda MS 7.3 grams, was completely lost to history for hundreds of years. It was hidden in the massive trunks of his secret writings, passed down through aristocratic families, and eventually sold off in the 1930s. It wasn't until the late 20th century, when scholars were carefully translating his horrific, messy handwriting in a library in Jerusalem, that the number 2060 practically jumped off the page and shocked the world. The greatest scientist in human history had mathematically locked in the year 2060 as the end of the world. But what exactly did Newton mean by the end of the world? Because we are so used to modern Hollywood movies, when we hear the word apocalypse or doomsday, we immediately picture massive asteroids smashing into the Earth, giant tsunamis wiping out cities, zombies, or a global nuclear war that burns the planet to an empty, lifeless crisp. But Newton's vision of 2060 was completely different, and in many ways far more fascinating. Newton did not believe the physical planet Earth was going to be destroyed. He believed the Earth was a beautiful, perfect machine designed by God, and God does not destroy his own perfect machines. Instead, Newton viewed the apocalypse as a massive cosmic reset. He believed that the year 2060 would mark the final collapse of the corrupt, evil human empires that had ruled the world since the days of Babylon and Rome. He predicted that the years leading up to 2060 would be filled with intense chaos, massive global wars, and the total ruin of wicked nations. The beast of corrupt religion and political tyranny would finally be destroyed. But this destruction was just the clearing of the stage. Once the corrupt human governments were swept away, Newton believed that Christ would physically return to Earth, but he wouldn't return to take everyone away to a magical kingdom in the clouds. He would return to set up a literal, physical, perfect government right here on Earth. Newton believed that after the year 2060, humanity would enter a glorious new epoch, a millennium of absolute peace. There would be no more war, no more disease, and no more suffering. The lost, perfect knowledge of the ancient world, the true laws of science, chemistry, and physics, would be restored to all of humanity. In Newton's mind, 2060 wasn't the year the clock exploded. It was the year the grand clockmaker finally stepped in, wiped away the rust, and restarted the pendulum for a perfect golden age. He was so confident in this date that he wrote a firm warning to any future prophets who might try to guess a different year. He wrote that his calculation put a stop to the rash conjectures of fanciful men who are frequently predicting the time of the end. In his mind, he had solved the math. The debate was over. By the time he was in his late 50s, Newton had mapped the stars, decoded the metals of the Earth, and calculated the end of time. But ironically, the man whose mind lived in the year 2060 was about to be abruptly pulled back into the gritty, dangerous reality of the present day. He was about to put down his Bible, leave his alchemy furnace behind, and step into the darkest, deadliest streets of London to fight a very real, very physical war. While Isaac Newton's mind was comfortably soaring through the distant future of 2060, mathematically calculating the exact moment Christ would return to establish a perfect global empire, his physical body was trapped in a highly dangerous claustrophobic present. To understand the immense psychological pressure Newton lived under every single day, we have to look at the massive, terrifying wall that separated his public, daytime persona from his private, nighttime reality. Newton was not just a scientist, he was an illusionist performing the greatest disappearing act in British history. By day, he was the untouchable golden boy of the English academic establishment. He held the prestigious title of Lucasian Professor of Mathematics at Trinity College, Cambridge. If you walked past him in the daylight, you would see a perfectly respectable, serious gentleman. He wore the heavy, formal academic robes required by the university. He walked the pristine, manicured lawns of Cambridge, exchanging polite, quiet nods with other esteemed professors and wealthy aristocratic students. He sat in the grand dining halls, eating at the high table reserved for the elite. Most importantly, he was a highly visible symbol of the Church of England. In the 1600s, there was absolutely no separation between science, education, and the state religion. Cambridge University was fundamentally a religious institution designed to train wealthy young men to become Anglican priests. Every student and professor was strictly required by law to attend daily chapel services, recite the official prayers, and demonstrate absolute, unwavering loyalty to the Crown and the Church. Newton did all of this flawlessly. He sat in the wooden pews of the chapel, bowing his head at all the right moments. He was the poster boy for the age of reason, living proof that a man could be a brilliant, rational scientist while remaining a perfectly obedient, orthodox Christian. But the moment the sun went down, the polite professor vanished. The heavy oak door to his private chambers locked from the inside, the candles were lit, and Isaac Newton, the ultimate heretic, went to work. In the dead of night, Newton wasn't just doing illegal alchemy, he was actively dismantling the entire foundation of the Christian religion. The core, non-negotiable bedrock of the Anglican Church, and indeed of the Catholic Church and almost all mainstream Christianity, is a theological concept known as the Holy Trinity. Simply put, this is the belief that God is one single entity, but simultaneously exists as three distinct, equal persons: God the Father, God the Son, Jesus Christ, and God the Holy Spirit. To the Church, this was a beautiful, divine mystery. You weren't supposed to mathematically understand it, you were just supposed to believe it. But Isaac Newton despised mysteries. He was the supreme mathematician of the universe. To him, the Trinity was not a divine mystery. It was an offensive, mathematically impossible lie. Newton looked at the Trinity and saw an equation that made absolutely no sense. 1 + 1 + 1 = 1. To a man who believed the universe was built on strict, flawless, mathematical laws created by a perfect God, this illogical concept felt like a slap in the face. He opened his Bible, completely ignoring the interpretations of the priests, and read the original Greek and Hebrew texts for himself. He came to a radical, dangerous conclusion. Newton believed that Jesus Christ was a magnificent, divine being, a savior and the Son of God, but he was absolutely not God himself. He was a created being, subordinate to the Almighty Father. To Newton, praying to Jesus as if he were the supreme creator was the ultimate, unforgivable sin, idolatry. He believed it was a violation of the very first of the Ten Commandments. If this was true, Newton asked himself, then how did the entire Christian world get it so wrong? To find the answer, the nighttime detective dove into the ancient history of the Roman Empire. He obsessively studied the records of the early church fathers from the 3rd and 4th centuries. He read thousands of pages of ancient debates. He pinpointed the exact moment the crime took place, the Council of Nicaea in the year 325 AD. According to Newton's historical research, the early Christians never believed in the Trinity, but in the 4th century the pagan Roman Emperor Constantine wanted to unite his fractured, chaotic empire. Constantine didn't care about theology, he cared about political power. Newton believed that corrupt, power-hungry bishops conspired with the emperor to invent the Trinity, combining pagan philosophies with Christianity to make it more appealing to the masses. Newton called this the Great Apostasy, the great falling away from the truth. He believed that for over 1,000 years the Church had been hijacked by a massive demonic fraud, and practically everyone in Europe, including his friends, his colleagues, and the King of England himself, had been completely brainwashed. Living with this secret was a crushing psychological burden. Newton believed he was one of the only men on earth who actually knew the truth about God. But he couldn't tell a single soul. He couldn't publish his findings because the punishment for denying the Trinity was unimaginably severe. This wasn't just a matter of losing his prestigious job or facing social embarrassment. The Blasphemy Act was a very real, very terrifying piece of legislation. If Newton's secret notebooks had been discovered by a maid or a colleague, he would have been instantly dragged before the religious court. He would have been stripped of his professorship, publicly humiliated and heavily fined. His books would have been burned. For repeat offences, the punishments included having your ears cut off, your tongue pierced with a hot iron, or being thrown into a miserable, disease-ridden prison for the rest of your life. And the threat of execution was always hovering in the background. In 1697, a young Scottish university student named Thomas Aikenhead was caught making jokes to his friends about the Trinity, calling it a ridiculous fairy tale. He was arrested, put on trial, and hanged by the neck until dead. He was only 20 years old. Newton knew exactly what the establishment was capable of, so he became a master of paranoia. When he wrote his theological essays, amounting to hundreds of thousands of words detailing the fraud of the Church, he wrote them on loose sheets of paper, ready to be hidden or thrown into the fire at a moment's notice. He never signed his name to these specific documents. He locked them away in the heavy trunks, burying them beneath his mathematical equations. He was living a life of utter, agonizing isolation. He was surrounded by thousands of people at Cambridge, yet he was completely alone. He could not have an honest conversation with anyone. Every smile was forced. Every prayer he mumbled in the university chapel was a calculated lie to stay alive. But inevitably, this perfectly constructed double life hit a terrifying crisis point. The strict rules of Trinity College contained a ticking time bomb. According to the university statutes, any man who held a fellowship at the college was required to officially become an ordained priest in the Church of England within 7 years of being appointed. It was non-negotiable. For Newton, the deadline was rapidly approaching in the year 1675. This was the ultimate test. To become an ordained priest, Newton would be forced to stand in front of a bishop, place his hand on a Bible, and swear a holy, binding oath to God that he fully believed in the Holy Trinity. He was trapped. If he took the oath, he would be committing perjury in front of the Almighty. In Newton's deeply religious mind, lying to God to save his career was a guaranteed one-way ticket to eternal damnation. He would lose his soul, but if he refused to take the oath, he would instantly be fired from his fellowship. He would lose his laboratory, his library, his income, and his social protection. Worse, his refusal would immediately trigger an aggressive investigation. The authorities would ask why the brilliant Isaac Newton was refusing holy orders. They would search his rooms. They would find the notebooks. The heretic would be exposed. For months, Newton agonized. The stress of the impending deadline ate away at him. He packed his bags, fully prepared to resign in disgrace and disappear into poverty rather than commit idolatry. But Newton was not just a genius. He was highly connected. He had powerful friends in London who did not know about his heresy, but who recognized his immense value to British science. In a desperate, last-minute political maneuver, Newton's allies reached out directly to the very top of the British Empire, King Charles II. They argued that it was a terrible waste to force the greatest mathematical mind in the world to waste his time acting as a common priest. They pleaded for a special, unique exception. Miraculously, the king agreed. Just weeks before Newton was forced to resign, King Charles II issued a formal royal decree. The decree stated that the holder of the Lucasian Professorship of Mathematics was permanently exempt from the requirement to take holy orders. Newton had dodged a bullet. He unpacked his bags. He could remain at Cambridge. He could keep his laboratory. And most importantly, he never had to swear the cursed oath to the Trinity. He had survived his greatest crisis through pure political luck. But the intense paranoia and the psychological toll of this near miss changed him. He realized how fragile his academic sanctuary truly was. He was tired of hiding. He was tired of the quiet, hypocritical life at Cambridge. The universe was a grand, complex machine, and Newton had successfully mapped its darkest corners. But there was one machine he hadn't yet conquered, the brutal, chaotic, and vicious machine of human society. It was time to leave the quiet libraries behind. Isaac Newton, the alchemist, the doomsday prophet, and the secret heretic, was about to pack his bags for the dirty, crime-infested streets of London. He was about to take on a completely new job, one that would require him to use every ounce of his paranoid, calculating genius to hunt down criminals in the dark. By the spring of 1696, Isaac Newton had survived a catastrophic mental breakdown, successfully hidden his treasonous alchemy from the government, and narrowly escaped being forced into the priesthood of a religion he secretly despised. For 30 years he had lived entirely inside his own head, pacing the quiet, manicured courtyards of Cambridge University. But suddenly, at the age of 53, the greatest scientist in the world made a completely shocking career change. He packed his bags, left academia behind, and moved to the loudest, dirtiest, and most dangerous city in the British Empire, London. He had just been appointed to a massive government position, the Warden of the Royal Mint. To understand why this was so bizarre, you have to understand what this job was supposed to be. In the 17th century, the job of Warden of the Royal Mint was considered a sinecure, a fancy, high-paying government title given to well-connected gentlemen as a reward. The warden was expected to sit in a comfortable office, drink fine wine, collect a massive salary, and let his underlings do all the actual work of manufacturing the nation's money. But the government fundamentally misunderstood who they had just hired. Isaac Newton did not know how to do anything halfway. He possessed a terrifying, obsessive, mechanical mind. When he arrived at the Royal Mint, which was located inside the heavily fortified, intimidating walls of the Tower of London, he didn't sit behind a desk. He treated the British economy like a broken clock that he needed to personally fix. And the British economy in 1696 was not just broken, it was entirely collapsing. England was facing a financial apocalypse. To understand this crisis simply, we have to forget about modern paper money or digital credit cards. In the 1600s, money was physical. A silver shilling was literally worth a shilling because it contained exactly 1 shilling's worth of pure silver. The value of the coin was the metal itself. But criminals had figured out a brilliant, devastatingly simple way to steal from the government. It was a practice called clipping. Because coins back then were stamped by hand, they didn't have perfectly round, grooved edges like our coins do today. Criminals would take a pair of heavy metal shears and carefully snip off tiny pieces of silver from the outer edges of the coins in their pockets. Then they would spend the slightly smaller coin at the market. Most merchants wouldn't notice the missing edge. The criminal would take all the tiny silver clippings they had stolen, melt them down in a hidden furnace, and illegally cast their own fake coins to spend. By the time Newton took over the mint, this problem had reached catastrophic levels. Almost every single coin in circulation in England had been brutally mutilated. A standard silver coin in a London pub was only worth about half of its actual face value because so much metal had been chopped off. This caused massive inflation. If you tried to buy a loaf of bread, the baker would weigh your coins. If they were clipped, he would demand twice as many. Even worse, foreign countries refused to trade with England. A merchant in France or the Netherlands would look at a handful of mangled English silver and laugh, refusing to accept it. The British military couldn't even pay its soldiers fighting overseas. The entire empire was weeks away from total bankruptcy. The government's desperate solution was a monumental project called the Great Recoinage. They decided to recall every single old clipped coin in the entire country, melt them all down in massive furnaces inside the Tower of London, and use giant horse-powered machines to press millions of brand new, perfectly round coins with special ridges on the edges so they could never be clipped again. It was the largest industrial manufacturing project in human history up to that point, and Isaac Newton was put in charge. The man who had secretly melted toxic metals in his hidden alchemy laboratory was now commanding a small army of hundreds of blacksmiths, engineers, and horses, melting down the wealth of an entire nation. Newton analyzed the mint's factories the same way he analyzed the orbits of the planets. He brought out his stopwatch. He tracked the exact movement of every single worker. He calculated the precise temperature of the furnaces and the kinetic force of the giant stamping presses. Within months, he had completely revolutionized the factory floor, increasing the production of new coins to a staggering 100,000 pounds of silver a week. He single-handedly saved the British economy from the brink of annihilation. But Newton quickly realized that fixing the machines was only half the battle. The new, perfect coins were rolling out of the Tower of London, but there was a dark, vicious underworld actively trying to destroy them. The counterfeiters, known as coiners, were organized crime syndicates. They were violent, highly skilled, and deeply entrenched in the criminal slums of London. Counterfeiting the king's money was not considered a simple theft. It was an attack on the crown itself, and therefore the crime of counterfeiting was legally classified as high treason. The punishment was not prison. The punishment was to be publicly dragged through the streets, hanged by the neck until almost dead, cut down while still breathing, and literally torn to pieces. For women, the punishment was being burned alive at the stake. Because the stakes were life and death, the criminal underworld was terrifyingly brutal. Counterfeiters routinely murdered witnesses, bribed corrupt police officers, and operated in heavy, armed gangs. The government expected the quiet academic Professor Newton to leave the messy business of catching these violent criminals to the local sheriffs. Instead, Isaac Newton became the most ruthless, terrifying detective in the history of London. He didn't just want to arrest the small-time criminals, he wanted to destroy the entire network. Newton secured a special budget and began building his own private intelligence agency. He became a spy master. Picture the supreme architect of physics, a man who had dined with the king, stripping off his fine velvet coats and dressing in the dirty, ragged clothes of a common labourer. Historians have found evidence that Newton personally went undercover, sneaking out of the Tower of London at night and vanishing into the filthy, dangerous taverns and brothels of the London slums to gather information. He used government money to bribe informants, creating a web of snitches who reported directly to him. If a criminal was caught, Newton would personally travel to the horrific, disease-ridden Newgate prison. He would sit in a damp, freezing interrogation room, staring across the table at a desperate counterfeiter. With cold, mathematical precision, Newton would offer them a deal. "Give me the names of your bosses and I will let you live. Refuse and I will personally ensure you go to the gallows." He conducted over 100 of these interrogations himself. He took thousands of pages of meticulous handwritten notes, building complex webs of criminal associations. He was practically inventing the modern criminal investigation, and through this vast spy network, Newton's gaze eventually locked onto a single, elusive target. The ultimate final boss of the London underworld, a man named William Challoner. If Isaac Newton was the genius of logic and order, William Challoner was the genius of chaos and deception. Challoner was an absolute master criminal. He had grown up in crippling poverty, starting his career by selling fake watches and stolen goods, but he was incredibly charismatic, highly intelligent, and an absolute psychopath. He eventually discovered he had a brilliant talent for metallurgy. He knew exactly how to mix cheap metals like copper and tin with just enough silver to create a fake coin that looked and felt perfectly real. Challoner became incredibly wealthy. He dressed like a high society lord, wearing expensive wigs and driving around London in a custom-built carriage. He lived in a massive mansion. He didn't just operate in the shadows, he openly mocked the law. Challoner's arrogance was legendary. At the height of the great recoinage crisis, Challoner actually walked through the front doors of the British Parliament, handed out perfectly forged coins, and loudly declared that the Royal Mint was completely incompetent. He told the politicians that he, William Challoner, knew how to fix the counterfeiting problem and demanded that they hire him to oversee the mint. It was a breathtaking, incredibly brazen con. He was actively running the biggest counterfeiting ring in the country, while simultaneously trying to get the government to hire him as the chief of police. This absolute disrespect infuriated Isaac Newton on a deeply personal level. Newton despised chaos, and he despised arrogance even more. William Chaloner had essentially declared war on the Warden of the Mint. The cat-and-mouse game between the greatest scientist on Earth and the greatest con artist in England is one of the most thrilling untold stories in history. Chaloner believed Newton was just a weak, pathetic academic. He thought Newton was a naive bookworm who could easily be outsmarted by street smarts. He actively taunted Newton, bribing Newton's informants to give him false information, and even organizing a plot to frame Newton's own officials for treason to get them fired. For months, Chaloner slipped through Newton's fingers. He was a ghost. Every time Newton raided a suspected counterfeiting lab, Chaloner had already cleared it out. When Newton finally managed to arrest Chaloner and throw him in Newgate prison, the master criminal simply bribed the main witnesses to flee to Scotland, leaving Newton with no evidence. The corrupt judges were forced to let Chaloner go free. Chaloner walked out of prison publicly laughing at Newton. It was a humiliating defeat for the great professor, but Chaloner severely underestimated the horrifying, relentless obsession of his enemy. Isaac Newton was the man who had stayed awake for 3 days straight, staring into a toxic alchemy furnace just to see a metal change color. He had calculated the weight of the planets. He did not give up. Newton went back to his desk. He opened a new notebook and he began to apply the exact same mathematical rigor he used for physics to the destruction of William Chaloner. Newton spent the next year systematically hunting down every single person who had ever met William Chaloner. He sent his secret agents across the entire country, tracking down Chaloner's ex-lovers, his former business partners, and the low-level thugs he had betrayed. Newton paid massive bribes. He offered absolute pardons to anyone who would testify against the crime boss. He built an ironclad, flawless web of evidence. In early 1699, Newton finally sprung his trap. His agents kicked down the door of a secret printing press where Chaloner was in the middle of forging incredibly complex paper lottery tickets. Chaloner was dragged back to Newgate prison. But this time, he wasn't laughing. When the trial began, the courtroom was packed. Chaloner stood in the prisoner's dock, expecting to use his charm and his money to bribe his way out, just like he had a dozen times before. But as the trial progressed, the blood drained from his face. Isaac Newton, sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom, completely unmoving, unleashed a devastating avalanche of witnesses. One by one, Newton brought forward the men and women Chaloner had ruined. He produced perfectly preserved physical evidence, forged coins, metal stamps, and fake paper bills. He laid out the timeline of Chaloner's crimes with the irrefutable logic of a mathematical proof. Chaloner panicked. He screamed at the judge. He completely lost his mind in the courtroom, throwing wild, insulting accusations at Newton, acting like a cornered animal, but it was useless. Newton had engineered a perfect legal machine, and the gears were crushing Chaloner to dust. The jury deliberated for only a few minutes before returning the verdict: guilty of high treason. In the days leading up to his execution, the arrogant mastermind completely broke down. The reality of his horrific, impending death set in. From his freezing, rat-infested cell, Chaloner wrote a series of pathetic, desperately weeping letters directly to Isaac Newton. "Oh dear sir," Challoner begged on the dirty paper, "nobody can save me but you. Oh God, my God, I shall be murdered unless you save me. Oh, I hope God will move your heart with mercy and pity to do this thing for me." Isaac Newton received the letters. He read them, and he did absolutely nothing. Newton did not possess a single drop of mercy for men who created chaos in his perfectly ordered universe. He ignored the pleas, locked the letters in his desk, and coldly returned to his calculations. On March 22nd, 1699, William Challoner was dragged on a wooden sled through the muddy, jeering streets of London to the massive, triangular gallows at Tyburn. He was violently trembling, sobbing uncontrollably, completely broken by the relentless force of the Warden of the Mint. The executioner placed the rough hemp rope around his neck, the cart was pulled away, and the great crime lord choked to death in front of a massive crowd. Isaac Newton did not attend the execution. He was already back inside the Tower of London, perfectly adjusting the weights of his silver coins, satisfied that the equation of justice had been beautifully and permanently solved. He had saved the economy and destroyed the criminal underworld. But the terrifying ruthlessness he unlocked to defeat Challoner was not going to be put back in a box. As Newton grew older and more powerful, he would turn this exact same cold, venomous fury against a much bigger target, his own fellow scientists. When Isaac Newton successfully sent the master counterfeiter William Challoner to the gallows, he proved something terrifying about his own nature. He proved that his brilliant calculating mind was not just an instrument for uncovering the laws of physics. When weaponized, his mind was a flawless, remorseless machine of destruction. Newton did not possess the ability to forgive. He viewed the world in absolute mathematical terms. You were either right or you were wrong. You were either his completely loyal disciple or you were his mortal enemy. And unfortunately for the scientific community of Europe, as Newton grew older and more powerful, he brought this exact same executioner's energy out of the criminal underworld and unleashed it into the quiet, polite halls of academia. To understand the dark, petty, and often cruel side of Isaac Newton, we have to look at his two greatest scientific rivalries. These were not polite disagreements between gentlemen. These were scorched earth, lifelong wars of annihilation. His first great enemy was a man named Robert Hooke. If you were alive in London in the 1670s, Robert Hooke was arguably just as famous as Isaac Newton. Hooke was a brilliant, hard-working scientist and the curator of experiments at the prestigious Royal Society. He was the man who coined the biological term cell after looking at a piece of cork under a microscope. He was an architectural genius who helped rebuild London after the Great Fire. But Hooke had a massive ego and he loved to claim credit for other people's ideas. The feud began over light. Early in his career, Newton published a revolutionary paper proving that white light was actually composed of all the colors of the rainbow using a glass prism. Hooke, reading the paper, publicly dismissed Newton's findings, claiming that he, Hooke, had already done those experiments years ago and that Newton's theories were flawed. For Newton, this public criticism was unbearable. As we saw with his alchemical paranoia, Newton was deeply insecure. He hated being questioned. Instead of debating Hooke, Newton completely withdrew, threatening to quit science entirely, just so he wouldn't have to deal with people disagreeing with him. He harbored a deep, simmering hatred for Hooke from that moment on. But the true explosion happened years later regarding the greatest discovery in human history: gravity. Before Newton published his masterpiece, the Principia, he and Hooke exchanged a series of letters. In one of these letters, Hooke casually suggested an idea. What if the force pulling planets toward the Sun gets weaker the further away they are, specifically following a mathematical rule called the inverse square law? Hooke threw the idea out there, but he lacked the supreme mathematical genius to actually prove it. Newton, however, did not. Newton took that concept, applied his godlike mathematical abilities, and built the entire law of universal gravitation. When Newton was preparing to publish his book, Hooke demanded that Newton include a preface thanking him for the original idea. Newton's reaction was absolute, blinding rage. He refused to give Hooke even a fraction of an ounce of credit. He went back through his massive, completed manuscript and viciously crossed out almost every single mention of Robert Hooke's name. He wanted to ensure that history would completely forget the man. During this bitter feud, Newton wrote a letter to Hooke that contains one of the most famous quotes in the history of science. You have likely heard it. Newton wrote, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." For centuries, this quote has been taught in schools as a beautiful example of scientific humility. It sounds like Newton is graciously thanking the great scientists of the past for paving the way. But modern historians who understand the bitter context of this letter suggest a much darker, far more petty interpretation. Robert Hooke was a man who suffered from a severe physical deformity. He had a severe spinal curvature, a hunched back, and was incredibly short in stature. When Isaac Newton, a tall, imposing man, wrote a letter directly to Robert Hooke talking about how he only saw the truth because he stood on the shoulders of giants, it was almost certainly not a compliment. It was a vicious, highly calculated insult mocking a disabled man's physical appearance. Newton outlived Hooke. When Hooke finally died in 1703, Newton immediately took over his position as the president of the Royal Society. And the moment Newton took the throne, Hooke's legacy began to systematically vanish. Shortly after Newton became president, the Royal Society moved to a new building. During the move, Robert Hooke's laboratory equipment was dismantled and lost. His papers were scattered. But most chillingly, the only known painted portrait of Robert Hooke completely disappeared. To this day, we do not know what Robert Hooke actually looked like, because no contemporary portrait of him exists. While it cannot be proven in a court of law, many historians strongly suspect that Isaac Newton personally ordered the portrait to be destroyed or thrown into a fire, permanently erasing his hated rival's face from the history of humanity. But if Robert Hooke was a nuisance, Newton's second rival was an existential threat. This rivalry sparked a conflict so bitter it practically divided the entire continent of Europe in half. The enemy was a brilliant German philosopher and mathematician named Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, and the battlefield was the invention of calculus. To understand why they fought so brutally over this, we have to understand what calculus is in the simplest terms possible. Before calculus, mathematics was frozen. You could use geometry to measure static, unmoving things like the area of a square field or the volume of a perfectly round bowl, but the universe is not frozen. The universe is constantly moving. An apple falls from a tree accelerating as it drops. A cannonball fires from a ship, tracing a curved, changing path through the air. The planets speed up and slow down as they orbit the sun. Old mathematics could not measure things that were constantly changing their speed and direction. Calculus was the magical mathematical tool invented to solve this exact problem. It is the mathematics of motion and change. Without calculus, we could never have built airplanes, launched rockets to the moon, or created modern computers. It is the engine of the modern world. So, who invented it? The truth is, both men did. Isaac Newton invented it first during the plague years in the 1660s, when he was a young student hiding in his farmhouse. But, true to his paranoid nature, he was terrified of criticism and kept his complex mathematical notes locked in his desk drawer for 30 years. He only shared them with a few close friends. Years later, over in Germany, Gottfried Leibniz was studying math. Completely independently, without ever seeing Newton's hidden notes, Leibniz had a brilliant flash of insight and invented his own version of calculus. And unlike Newton, Leibniz immediately published his work. He shared it with the world. He created simple, elegant symbols for calculus that were so good, they are the exact same symbols high school students use today. When the scientific community praised Leibniz as the sole inventor of this revolutionary new math, Newton felt like he was being violently robbed. Newton's immense ego could not handle the idea of sharing the spotlight. He believed Leibniz was a liar and a thief who must have somehow seen his secret notes. Thus began the calculus wars. Newton did not fight fair. He used his immense power as the president of the Royal Society to completely destroy the German mathematician. When the international scientific community demanded a formal investigation to decide who the true inventor was, Leibniz happily agreed, trusting the esteemed Royal Society in London to be an impartial judge. He believed they would look at the evidence fairly. What Leibniz didn't know was that the entire trial was rigged from the start. The Royal Society formed a neutral committee to investigate the claims, but Isaac Newton secretly handpicked every single member of the committee. Even worse, the final, independent report published by the Royal Society, which officially declared Leibniz a plagiarist and a fraud, was not written by the committee. It was written, in secret, by Isaac Newton himself. He wrote a glowing report praising his own genius, completely destroying Leibniz's reputation, and then published it under other people's names to make it look like an objective scientific consensus. Newton had essentially acted as the prosecutor, the judge, and the jury in his own trial. The result was devastating for Leibniz. His reputation in Europe was ruined. He lost his powerful patrons. When he died a few years later in 1716, he was a disgraced, impoverished man. Only one person attended his funeral. Did Newton feel any remorse for destroying a brilliant man's life over a matter of pride? Not a shred. Years later, Newton reportedly gloated to his friends, taking immense pleasure in the fact that he had broken Leibniz's heart. When we look at the destruction of William Challoner, the erasure of Robert Hooke, and the psychological assassination of Gottfried Leibniz, a very dark, tragic picture of Isaac Newton emerges. Here was a man whose mind was vast enough to hold the entire universe. He could close his eyes and perfectly visualize the invisible gravitational tethers connecting Jupiter to the sun. He could read the ancient Hebrew of the Book of Daniel and calculate the end of empires. He believed he was decoding the literal thoughts of God. But for all his cosmic understanding, Isaac Newton was utterly, profoundly disconnected from humanity. He was a man who lived a life of terrifying self-imposed isolation. He never married. There is no historical record of him ever having a romantic relationship or expressing physical affection for another human being. He had no children. He had incredibly few friends, and those he did have, he alienated during his paranoid, Mercury-induced breakdowns. He spent his nights locked in a smoky room, breathing poison, trying to mutate heavy metals into magical elixirs. He spent his days crushing his rivals with Machiavellian political schemes. He believed that almost everyone around him, the priests, the professors, the kings, were brainwashed fools participating in a grand demonic lie. He loved the idea of humanity. He spent decades calculating the exact year of 2060, desperate for Christ to return and establish a perfect, peaceful golden age for mankind, but he seemed to absolutely despise actual living, breathing humans. As he approached the end of his incredibly long life, the fires in his alchemy furnaces had long since burned out. The counterfeiters were dead, his scientific rivals were buried and forgotten. He had conquered the intellectual world. But as the 84-year-old man sat alone in his room in London, surrounded by millions of words of secret, heretical diaries and mathematical codes, he realized there was one final problem he had to solve. He had to ensure that the world never found out who he really was. The great illusionist had to perform one final trick before the curtain closed. By the bitter, freezing winter of early 1727, the great, relentless clockwork of Isaac Newton's life was finally beginning to wind down. He was 84 years old, living in a grand wealthy estate in the wealthy neighbourhood of Kensington in London. The man who had survived massive mercury poisoning, political purges, and the brutal gang wars of the criminal underworld was finally losing his battle against time. His physical condition was agonizing. He was suffering from severe kidney stones, a condition that brought him unimaginable, blinding pain. He spent most of his days confined to a heavy wooden chair, his body failing, his incredible mind trapped inside a dying shell. But even in his final weeks, as the shadow of death crept closer, Isaac Newton's paranoid, calculating genius did not rest. He knew exactly what was going to happen the moment his heart stopped beating. He knew that the king, the bishops of the Church of England, and the esteemed members of the Royal Society would immediately descend upon his house. They would want to secure the papers of the greatest scientist in human history. They would open his desks, crack the locks on his heavy wooden chests, and read his millions of words. And Newton knew that if they read everything, the perfect, pristine monument of his life would instantly shatter. They would find the green lions and the toxic alchemy recipes. They would find the venomous, heretical essays declaring the Holy Trinity a demonic fraud. They would find the prophecies predicting the violent end of their own empires in the year 2060. The supreme architect of physics realized he had to perform one final, magnificent act of creation. He had to create his own historical ghost. In those final, painful weeks, Newton ordered his servants to build roaring fires in the fireplaces of his home, and then slowly, methodically, the old man began to sort through a lifetime of secrets. We will never know exactly what Isaac Newton threw into the flames during those dark winter nights. The smell of burning parchment and melting wax filled the Kensington estate. He was acting as his own supreme judge and executioner, curating his legacy, deciding exactly what the future was allowed to know about him. Did he burn calculations that were even more terrifying than the 2060 apocalypse? Did he burn the final toxic results of his Mercury experiments? Or was he simply destroying the most damning evidence of his religious heresy to ensure he wouldn't be branded a criminal after his death? Whatever he burned, he was essentially killing the last magician so that the father of modern science could live forever. When Isaac Newton finally passed away in his sleep on March 20th, 1727, the fire in the grate had burned down to cold grey ash. As we saw at the very beginning of our journey, he was given a funeral fit for a conquering emperor and buried in the hallowed royal grounds of Westminster Abbey. And shortly after, his surviving family members opened the trunks he left behind, panicked at the bizarre, magical writings they found, and locked them away in a dark library for over 200 years. It wasn't until John Maynard Keynes bought that battered trunk at the Sotheby's auction in 1936 that the world finally realized the truth. And the most chilling part of Keynes's discovery was the realization that the trunk he bought, stuffed with millions of words of alchemy, magic, and doomsday prophecies, only contained the papers that Newton had forgotten or refused to burn. It was merely the tip of a massive, dark iceberg. So, what are we living in the modern world supposed to make of this bizarre, contradictory man? How do we reconcile the genius who gave us the laws of motion with the paranoid wizard who tasted toxic metals and tried to mathematically decode the mind of God? The story of Isaac Newton forces us to completely re-evaluate the thin, almost invisible boundary between science and magic. Today, we like to put things in neat, organized boxes. We are taught in schools that science is a clean, rational, and logical progression of facts. We are taught that magic, religion, and the occult are the exact opposite: superstitious, chaotic, and irrational. We assume that a true scientist must completely reject the supernatural, but Newton proves that this is a modern illusion. Isaac Newton did not invent calculus and physics because he was a modern secular scientist. He invented them because he was a deeply religious, obsessive mystic. He didn't look at the universe and see a random collection of atoms. He looked at the universe and saw a divine cryptogram, a massive puzzle deliberately set by the Almighty. He believed that the same God who hid the timeline of the apocalypse in the book of Daniel had also hidden the laws of gravity in the empty space between the stars. To Newton, reading the Bible, melting lead in a furnace, and observing the orbit of a comet were all the exact same job. He was a detective trying to read the mind of the Creator. And if we are completely honest with ourselves, Newton's greatest scientific discovery, gravity, is essentially a magical concept. When Newton first published his theory of gravity, many of his scientific rivals actually mocked him. They said he was bringing occult magic back into science. Why? Because Newton couldn't explain what gravity was or how it worked. He couldn't show anyone a physical rope connecting the Earth to the Moon. He just mathematically proved that an invisible, silent, untouchable force reaches across millions of miles of completely empty space and pulls massive objects together. To the people of the 17th century, an invisible force acting across empty space sounded exactly like a magical spell. And in a way it is. The universe is incredibly strange. Isaac Newton's life teaches us that the path to absolute truth is never a straight, clean line. It is messy, it is dangerous, it requires a level of obsession that borders on madness. If Newton wasn't crazy enough to believe he could calculate the exact year the world would end, or crazy enough to believe he could pull the energy of a star into a bowl of cooling metal, his mind might never have been open enough to imagine the invisible tethers of gravity. His darkness, his paranoia, and his strange, magical beliefs were not distractions from his genius. They were the very fuel that powered it. We live in a world built on his equations. Every time an airplane takes off, every time a satellite orbits the Earth, and every time we look at the stars and understand how they move, we are using the tools forged by a man who spent his nights breathing poison and talking to angels in the dark. He was the architect of reason, and he was the absolute master of the shadows. He truly was the last of the magicians. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the hidden shadows of history. If this journey changed the way you look at the heroes of our past, please make sure to subscribe to Historic Sleep. Let me know in the comments below. Do you think humanity will ever experience another mind as brilliantly chaotic as Isaac Newton's? Until next time, keep questioning the official story and have a good night.